It started with the radio. I was sitting in my living room, flipping through an old magazine, when the static crackled to life. The sound was sharp, like nails scraping against glass, and it made me jump. I hadn't turned the radio on. It had been silent for weeks, collecting dust on the shelf. But now, it was alive, spitting out garbled words that I could barely understand. Emergency alert. Severe weather. Blackout. Seek shelter immediately. The voice was distorted, almost robotic, and it sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked over to the radio. The dials were turned off, but the static continued, growing louder and more frantic. I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, the lights flickered. Then, everything went dark. The blackout was instant. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint glow of the digital clock on the microwave, even the streetlights outside, all of it vanished. I was left in complete silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the radio. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was black. Dead. No signal, no power, nothing. I stumbled to the window and pulled back the curtain. The street was pitch black, not a single light in sight. The sky was a deep, unnatural shade of gray, like the color of ash. No stars, no moon, just an oppressive darkness that seemed to press down on the world. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I realized I couldn't hear anything. No cars, no dogs barking, no distant hum of the city. Just silence. I grabbed the radio, hoping for more information, but all I got was static. Then, faintly, I heard something else. A voice, barely audible beneath the noise. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I could make out a single word.
Sam.
My blood ran cold. It sounded like my friend Alex. But how? Alex lived across town, and the radio shouldn't have been able to pick up anything like that. I tried to respond, but the static drowned out my voice. I shook the radio, desperate for clarity, but the voice was gone. I decided to call Alex. My phone was dead, so I grabbed the landline. No dial tone. I tried 3 times, but nothing. I tried my parents next. Same result. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel the panic creeping in. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I went outside, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the street was deserted. No cars, no people, not even the faint glow of a candle in a window. It was as if the entire neighborhood had vanished. The wind picked up, cold and biting, but there was no rain, no thunder, no lightning. Just that heavy, oppressive darkness. I went back inside and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just a bad storm. Maybe the power would come back on soon. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. The radio, the blackout, the silence. It all felt wrong. I decided to wait it out. I lit a candle and sat on the couch, the radio still crackling softly beside me. The voice didn't come back, but the static seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It felt like it was watching me, waiting for something. Hours passed and nothing changed. The darkness outside remained, the silence unbroken. I tried the radio again, but all I got was static. Then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. A faint, strained voice, barely audible beneath the noise.
Sam, help.
It was Alex. I was sure of it. But how? And why did he sound so weak, so desperate? I tried to respond, but the static drowned me out again. I felt a surge of frustration and fear. What was happening? Where was everyone? I decided to go to Alex's house. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the wind whipping around me. The neighborhood was still deserted, the houses dark and silent. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. When I reached Alex's house, I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I tried the door, but it was locked. I peered through the window, but the house was dark. I called out Alex's name, but there was no response. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, when I heard something. A faint crackle, like a radio turning on. It was coming from inside the house. I knocked again, harder this time, but still no answer. I felt a surge of frustration and fear. Where was Alex? Why wasn't he answering? I decided to try the walkie-talkie we kept for emergencies. I ran back home, my heart pounding, and dug through the emergency supplies until I found it. I turned it on and called out to Alex. At first there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, I heard his voice.
Sam, I'm here.
Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. His voice sounded weak, almost sickly, and there was something else. A faint, rhythmic beeping in the background, like a heart monitor. I tried to respond, but the connection was too weak. I could barely hear him.
Sam, something's wrong. I don't know where I am.
His voice trailed off, and the static returned. I tried to call him again, but there was no response. I felt a surge of panic. What was happening to him? Where was he? And why couldn't I reach him? I decided to try again in the morning. For now, I was alone, trapped in the darkness with nothing but the static and the faint, haunting voice of my friend. The next morning, the blackout hadn't lifted. The sky was still that same unnatural gray, and the silence was deafening. I woke up to the sound of the radio crackling again, but this time it wasn't just static. There were voices, faint, distorted, and overlapping, like a dozen people trying to speak at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, almost panicked. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and tried calling Alex again. This time, there was no response, just silence. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. Where was he? Was he even alive? I decided to try the radio again, hoping for some kind of explanation, but all I got was more static and those faint, garbled voices. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for the power to come back on or for someone to show up. I decided to venture out further, beyond the neighborhood, to see if anyone else was around. Maybe there was a shelter or a place where people had gathered. Maybe Alex was there. I packed a bag with some essentials, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and headed out. The streets were still deserted, the houses dark and silent. The wind had died down, but the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As I reached the edge of the neighborhood, I noticed something strange. The trees were bent at odd angles, their branches twisted and gnarled, as if they had been frozen mid-storm. The ground was littered with leaves and twigs, but there was no sign of rain or wind. It was as if the storm had passed through and left everything in its wake, but without any of the usual aftermath. I kept walking, my unease growing with every step. The further I went, the more I noticed how wrong everything felt. The houses looked abandoned, their windows dark and lifeless. The cars parked in driveways were covered in a thin layer of dust, as if they hadn't been touched in weeks. And the silence, it was everywhere, pressing down on me like a weight. I reached the gas station at the edge of town, hoping to find someone, anyone, but it was empty. The doors were wide open, and the inside was a mess. Shelves were overturned, food was scattered across the floor, and the air smelt sour, like spoilt milk and rotting meat. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and saw something that made my blood run cold. The cash register was open, and the money was still inside. The refrigerators were stocked with food, but it was all spoilt, the smell making me gag. And in the corner, I saw a chair, overturned, with a pair of shoes lying next to it. It looked like someone had been sitting there, but there was no one around. I grabbed a few cans of food and a bottle of water, my hands shaking as I stuffed them into my bag. I didn't want to stay here any longer than I had to. The place felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I stepped back outside, I heard something, a faint, rhythmic beeping, like the sound I had heard on the walkie-talkie. It was coming from the direction of the highway. I hesitated, unsure if I should investigate, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The highway was deserted, the cars abandoned in the middle of the road. Some of them had their doors open, as if the drivers had just gotten out and walked away. The beeping grew louder as I approached a car that was parked on the shoulder. The engine was still running, the headlights casting a faint glow in the darkness. I walked up to the car and peered inside. The driver's seat was empty, but the radio was on, tuned to the same frequency as my walkie-talkie. The beeping was coming from there, a steady, pulsing sound that made my skin crawl. I reached in and turned it off, but the beeping didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere else now, further down the road. I felt a surge of panic. What was happening? Where was everyone? And why did it feel like I was being watched? I turned around, my flashlight sweeping the area, but there was no one there. Just the empty cars, the twisted trees, and the oppressive silence. I decided to head back home. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something I couldn't see. The walk back was tense, every sound making me jump. When I finally reached my house, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart pounding. The radio was still crackling, the voices louder now, more insistent. I turned it off, but the static continued, growing louder and more frantic. I felt a surge of frustration and fear. What was happening? Why couldn't I escape it? I decided to try the walkie-talkie one more time. I turned it on and called out to Alex. This time, there was a response, but it wasn't his voice. It was something else, something distorted and inhuman, like a voice being played backward. It was saying something, but I couldn't understand it. The words were garbled, almost like a chant. I dropped the walkie-talkie, my hands shaking. What was that? Where was Alex? And why did it feel like the world was closing in on me? By the third day, the blackout still hadn't lifted. The sky remained that same unnatural gray, and the silence was now punctuated by faint, distant noises, creaks, groans, and the occasional crackle of static. The radio had become unbearable. Even when turned off, it would occasionally sputter to life, spewing distorted voices and that same rhythmic beeping. I had thrown a blanket over it, but the sound seeped through, like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. I tried to focus on practical things, food, water, staying sane, but the eerie stillness of the world outside gnawed at me. I decided to check on Alex again. Maybe he had returned home, or maybe I'd find some clue about where he'd gone. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and my flashlight, steeling myself for another trip into the emptiness. When I reached Alex's house, the door was still locked, but something felt different. The air was colder, and the faint smell of something metallic hung in the air, like rust or blood. I knocked on the door, louder this time, and called his name. No response. I peered through the window again, but the house was still dark. Then, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint red glow coming from the back of the house. I circled around to the backyard, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The glow was coming from the basement window, a dull, pulsing light that seemed to sync with the beeping I'd heard earlier. My heart raced as I approached the window, my breath fogging the glass. I wiped it clean and looked inside. The basement was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, crude, jagged lines that looked like they'd been carved into the plaster. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat a radio, glowing faintly red. The beeping was coming from there, steady and relentless. But what made my blood run cold was what lay next to the radio, a pair of glasses, cracked and smeared with something dark. Alex's glasses. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What had happened here? Where was Alex? And what was that radio doing in his basement? I needed to get inside, but the door was locked, and the windows were too small to climb through. I decided to go home and think of a plan, but as I turned to leave, I heard something. A faint, guttural sound, like a voice trying to form words. It was coming from the basement. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out a single word, repeated over and over.
Help! Help! Help!
It was Alex's voice, but it was wrong, distorted, like it was being dragged through gravel. I called out to him, my voice shaking, but there was no response. Just that same word, over and over, growing louder and more frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran back to my house, my heart pounding, the sound of Alex's voice echoing in my ears. When I got inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The radio was still crackling, the voices louder now, more insistent. I tore the blanket off and stared at it, my hands shaking. The static suddenly cleared, and a voice came through, clear, cold, and utterly inhuman.
You can't escape.
I slammed my hand down on the radio, silencing it, but the words lingered in the air like a poison seeping into my mind. I felt a surge of panic. What was happening? What was that thing in the basement? And why did it feel like it was watching me? I decided to try the walkie-talkie again, desperate for some kind of connection. I turned it on and called out to Alex, but all I got was static. Then, faintly, I heard something. A faint, strained voice, barely audible beneath the noise.
Sam, don't come back.
It was Alex. His voice was weak, almost a whisper, but it was him. I tried to respond, but the static drowned me out. I felt a surge of frustration and fear. What was happening to him? What was in that basement? I decided to go back. I couldn't leave him there, not after hearing his voice. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and headed back to Alex's house, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the basement window, the red glow was still there, pulsing like a heartbeat. I took a deep breath and smashed the window, the sound of breaking glass echoing in the silence. I climbed inside, the air thick with the smell of rust and something else. Something sweet and sickly, like rotting fruit. The basement was colder than before, the walls slick with moisture. The radio was still beeping, the red glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. I approached the table, my crowbar raised, and saw something that made my stomach churn. The symbols on the walls weren't just carved. They were moving, shifting like living things. The lines twisted and writhed, forming shapes that made no sense but filled me with a deep, primal fear. I turned to the radio, my hands shaking, and saw something even worse. The radio wasn't just glowing, it was bleeding. A thick, dark liquid oozed from the seams, pooling on the table and dripping onto the floor. The beeping grew louder, more frantic, and the voice returned, cold and mocking.
You shouldn't have come.
I swung the crowbar at the radio, smashing it into pieces. The beeping stopped, and the red glow faded, but the silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air before a storm. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something. A faint, guttural sound, like a voice trying to form words. It was coming from the shadows. The sound from the shadows was low and guttural, like a voice trying to form words but failing. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, where the darkness was thickest. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it in that direction, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal something that made my blood run cold. Alex was there, but it wasn't Alex, not the Alex I knew. He was hunched over, his body twisted at unnatural angles, his skin pale and slick with sweat. His eyes were wide, unblinking and filled with a terror I couldn't comprehend. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, just that same guttural noise, like his voice had been stolen. "Alex!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "What happened to you?" He didn't respond. His head twitched, his eyes darting around the room as if he were seeing things I couldn't. I took a step closer, my crowbar still raised, but he flinched, his body jerking violently. The movement was wrong, too fast, too fluid, like his bones had turned to rubber.
Don't. Come. Closer.
He finally managed to say, his voice strained and broken. Each word sounded like it was being ripped from his throat. "Alex, it's me, Sam," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to get out of here. Whatever's happening, we can figure it out together." He shook his head, his movements jerky and erratic.
No. You don't understand. It's here. It's always been here.
"What's here?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, the basement lights flickered on, briefly, just for a second, and I saw something that made my stomach churn. The walls were covered in more of those symbols, but now they were glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the rhythm of the beeping that had come from the radio. And in the corner, behind Alex, there was something else, a shadow, darker than the rest, shifting and writhing like a living thing. The lights went out again, plunging the basement back into darkness. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the batteries were dying. I shook it, trying to keep it alive, but the light dimmed further, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. "Alex, we need to go," I said, my voice urgent. "Now!" He didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the shadow behind him, his body trembling.
It's too late. It's already inside me.
"What are you talking about?" I demanded, my fear turning to frustration. "What's inside you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he let out a low, guttural moan, his body convulsing violently. I took a step back, my crowbar raised, as his head snapped toward me, his eyes now glowing faintly red. His mouth opened, and a voice came out, but it wasn't his. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice.
You shouldn't have come.
I swung the crowbar, not thinking, just reacting. It connected with something solid, and Alex, or whatever was controlling him, let out a scream that wasn't human. The sound echoed through the basement, shaking the walls and sending a shower of dust and plaster raining down from the ceiling. I turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs and out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my own house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. What had I just seen? What was happening to Alex? And what was that thing in the basement? The radio crackled to life again, the static louder now, more insistent. I turned it off, but the voices continued, faint and distorted, like they were coming from inside my head. I felt a surge of panic. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just outside, it was inside me too. I decided to try the walkie-talkie one more time. I turned it on and called out to Alex, but all I got was static. Then, faintly, I heard something, a faint, strained voice, barely audible beneath the noise.
Sam, it's too late. It's in the air. It's in the water. It's in you.
The voice trailed off, and the static returned. I felt a surge of dread. What did he mean? What was in the air? What was in me? I decided to check the water. I went to the kitchen and turned on the faucet, but nothing came out. I tried the bathroom, but the pipes were dry. The water was gone, just like the power, just like everyone else. I felt a surge of panic. What was happening? Why was everything falling apart? And why did it feel like I was being watched? I decided to go to the attic. Maybe from there I could see something. Anything that would explain what was going on. I climbed the stairs, my flashlight flickering weakly, and pushed open the attic door. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The attic was cluttered with old boxes and furniture, but in the center of the room was something that made my blood run cold. A radio, just like the one in Alex's basement, glowing faintly red. The beeping was there, steady and relentless, and the voices were louder now, more insistent. I approached the radio, my hands shaking, and saw something that made my stomach churn. The symbols were there too, carved into the wood of the attic walls, pulsing faintly in time with the beeping. And in the corner, behind the radio, was a shadow, darker than the rest, shifting and writhing like a living thing. I turned and ran, slamming the attic door shut behind me. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just outside. It was inside the house, inside me. The house felt colder now, like the walls were breathing ice. My flashlight flickered, its light weak and shaky, as I hurried to the kitchen. My nose started to itch, and when I wiped it, my hand came away smeared with black goo, thick and sticky, like motor oil. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. This isn't right. This isn't normal. The walkie-talkie in my pocket buzzed suddenly, making me jump. Alex's voice crackled out, but it didn't sound like him anymore. It was flat and cold, like a robot pretending to be human.
Sam, stop fighting. They're in your blood now. You can't win.
I threw the walkie-talkie against the wall. It shattered into pieces, but Alex's laugh kept playing, echoing from the radio on the kitchen counter. The red glow from its screen pulsed faster, like it was excited. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and smashed the radio until it was silent. Black liquid oozed out of it, smelling like rotten eggs. I needed to get out. Now. I stuffed my backpack with bottled water, a bag of chips, and a flashlight. My hands shook so bad I could barely zip it up. When I looked in the hallway mirror, I barely recognized myself. My eyes were bloodshot, with thin black veins spreading across the whites. My skin looked gray, like I'd been rolled in ash. It's happening to me. Just like Alex. I ran outside, the cold air slapping my face. The sky was still that sick gray color, and the wind moaned like a hurt animal. I didn't know where to go, but my legs carried me toward the highway tunnel. Alex and I used to dare each other to walk through it at night. Now, it was the only place left. Abandoned cars littered the road, doors hanging open. One car's headlights were still on, lighting up the driver's seat. I crept closer, knife in hand, and gagged. The driver was slumped over the wheel, their face melted like candle wax. Their eyes were gone, just black holes, and their mouth hung open in a silent scream. On their lap was a radio, cracked and glowing red. The same red as the one in Alex's basement. The radios. It's the radios. Suddenly it clicked. The static, the voices, the black goo. The radios weren't just broken. They were spreading whatever this was, like a virus. And I'd been listening to them this whole time. I smashed the radio in the car with my hammer. The red light dimmed, and for a second the air felt lighter. But the hum in the distance grew louder, angrier. I turned and ran toward the tunnel. The tunnel was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and something sweet, like rotting fruit. My flashlight died completely, so I felt my way along the slimy walls. Up ahead, a red glow pulsed, and the hum turned into a screech, like metal scraping metal. 3 black shapes floated in the middle of the tunnel. They were taller than me, flat and rectangular, like doors made of shadow. Their surfaces were smooth, but their edges wobbled, like they weren't fully here. And then I saw the eyes, dozens of tiny white dots covering them, all staring at me.
Subject Sam.
The shapes droned in unison, their voices buzzing in my skull.
Stop resisting. You belong to us now.
The air around them burned like a furnace. I stumbled back, but the tunnel exit was gone, sealed shut by shifting concrete. The shapes drifted closer, their eyes glowing red. My skin blistered, and I screamed, swinging my hammer wildly. It passed right through them, like hitting smoke. One of them pressed against my chest. Pain exploded through me, like 1,000 needles stabbing my veins. My vision blurred, and I saw flashes. Alex tied to a chair, symbols carved into his skin. Radios in every house, whispering to people. The black shapes watching from the dark, always watching.
You are a bridge.
They hissed.
You will spread us.
But then, I remembered smashing the radio in the car. How the red light faded. The radios are their weakness. I dropped to my knees, pretending to give up. The shapes hovered closer, their heat scorching my face. With my last bit of strength, I yanked the broken radio from my backpack, the one I'd smashed earlier, and hurled it at the nearest shape. The radio shattered against it. The shape shuddered, its red eyes flickering. A crack split down its middle, and blinding white light burst out. The other shapes screeched and recoiled, their edges fraying like torn paper. I didn't wait. I sprinted past them, toward the crack of daylight at the far end of the tunnel. The shapes' screams followed me, shaking the ground, but I didn't look back. I squeezed through a gap in the rubble, scraping my arms and knees, and tumbled out into the open. The world outside the tunnel was wrong. The sky was still gray, but the trees were bare and twisted like giant skeletons. The grass was dead, crunching under my feet. And my town, it was gone. In its place stood jagged black buildings, glowing red from within. The shapes had taken everything. I walked for hours, my legs numb. The black veins on my skin spread, and my joints ached like they were full of broken glass. But I kept going, following the highway until I found a payphone. The receiver dangled, rusted and broken. I picked it up, praying for a dial tone. Static hissed, then a woman's voice cut through.
If anyone's listening, the infection spreads through radio signals. Destroy every radio you find. Don't.
Her voice turned into a scream, then silence. I sank to the ground, clutching the receiver. The static buzzed in my ears, itching deep inside my brain. I pulled out my laptop, its battery somehow still alive, and typed this message. My fingers left black smudges on the keys. They're here now. The 3 black shapes float at the edge of the highway, watching me. My vision's blurring, but I finally understand. The radios are their doors, their way in, and I'm becoming one too. But I won't let them win. I'll walk until I can't. I'll warn everyone I meet. And if you're reading this, smash every radio. Don't listen to the static. They're coming.